Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann Rabke, and my husband, Carl Rabke. Embodiment Matters is an ongoing, rich conversation about what it really means to be embodied and why and how embodiment matters so much in our daily lives and in our modern world. You can find out more about our wonderful guests, about our work. You can sign up for our newsletter and find out how to become a supporting member of our podcast online at embodimentmatters.com.
In this episode, I speak with Ian MacKenzie. And Ian is a writer and speaker and filmmaker. He's done some wonderful films, including Sacred Economics, Lost Nation Road, Amplify Her, Prayer to the Earth, an Indigenous response to these times. And Ian is also the host of the Mythic Masculine Podcast. And a lot of this conversation we have weaves through several of the themes that have come up in that Mythic Masculine Podcast. And it's interesting because we've shared a lot of the same guests on the Embodiment Matters podcast, like Philip Shepard, Sharon Blackie, Bayo Komalafe, Michael Mead, Daniel Four, Charles Eisenstein. So there are kind of similar threads we're following, but to hear these conversations in the realm of looking at gender and what is a mythic masculine and what does it mean to be a man in these times where old stories are dissolving and new ones are emerging. And I've found the quality of the conversation on Ian's podcast to be just really fresh and hitting on some core essential questions and inquiries. So we look at lots of things in this conversation, looking at the relationship with power and masculinity, looking at some of the challenges around terms like toxic masculinity, and looking at what is it that's toxic. At one point, we refer back to a conversation Ian had with Pat McCabe, where she said, we don't even know what masculine or feminine is outside of this model of kind of top-down domination, and how that polarity could be completely different in what she puts forth as a thriving life model, or what Charles Eisenstein might call the more beautiful world the heart knows is possible. So, yeah, we hit on some just great topics, and hope you enjoy the conversation. And if you want to find out more about Ian's work, you can visit ianmac.com, or the podcast is themythicmasculine.com. Welcome, Ian MacKenzie. I'm so glad to have you here and look forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Carl.
So one jump-off place we often like to start with in these conversations is just to ask, from your perspective, what is embodiment? Because there are so many different entry points to that. So in this moment, Ian, what is embodiment to you?
Mm-hmm. What is embodiment? I used to think that it meant being able to connect with a kind of physicality, to feel embodied. I used to play soccer for a number of years, and I did some martial arts for a number of years as well, and that sense of just being, inhabiting one's body in a degree of physicality. That to me used to feel like what embodiment meant, and more recently, I believe through conversations I've had and practitioners I've met, that I've come to understand that for me, embodiment now seems to mean tapping into another kind of intelligence. So that, there's an intelligence often understood to be in the head, in this sort of rational intellectual culture. And a lot of men, including myself, tend to, appreciate, maybe over-rely on the intelligence in the head. And in many ways, dismiss outright the idea that there's other kinds of intelligences. And so that's what I'm coming to learn, that the body has its own intelligence, no less, if not more, magnificent than the one found in the head. And, that really feels like an absolutely different territory than I'm used to.
Yeah, beautiful response. I was just thinking of, Bio Komalofe in the conversation we had said, reason is supposed to not be the king, but more like the janitor, like someone who helps kind of clean things up.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I would love to, I want to dive into some of these themes you've explored on your Mythic Masculine podcast, which I have deeply enjoyed those conversations. And it's really hit a spot in the conversation around masculinity that I've been yearning for a long time. So I appreciate that. But maybe if you wanted to just talk a little bit about how that came to be, what's sort of were the seeds of starting these conversations for you?
Well, I've been a filmmaker now probably 12 years, primarily documentaries. And, for a long time, I was really looking into, really what will it take to create transformative change, on a global scale, big questions. And I think early on, I learned that film, I believe, is a deep catalyst because it has the unique alchemy of combining visuals and story and music and all these into a kind of mimetic transmission that really has the power to affect people in a significant way. And so I think that's why I gravitated towards film and documentary. And throughout that journey, I explored a lot of different places from Occupy Wall Street to Burning Man to Fukushima after their partial meltdown, and looked to the realms of spirituality and culture, economics, and places that I felt, okay, is this what's going to create the change? And I think in my own life, I ended up having an experience at Burning Man, like many good stories start, where it sort of planted the seed of an idea for a film around this idea of the rise of the feminine. I actually saw a female artist by the name of Applecat perform, and there was something in that I, witnessed. I was like, wow, there's something she's doing that's different, and I didn't really know what it was. I had a sense of this, word came to me that I heard somewhere about the dark feminine, which feels categorically different than this idea of like, the divine feminine, often seen as this light being and, a kind of pleasant and nice and the rest. And that there was this other side, this like dark carnal feminine that she seemed to be inhabiting or expressing. And so that got me really curious about this idea of the rise of the feminine, in particular, told through female artists that were actually expressing it in some way. And then that became an inquiry, that led to me reading authors like Marion Woodman and other archetypal psychologists that, have really used the work of Carl Jung and that whole lens of mythology, Clarissa Pincola's Estes. And that really was a 5-year journey into the feminine, and actually became a whole project called Amplify Her, of which people can, see the film. And we developed a whole graphic novel, motion comic series, like it's a big thing. And it was through that journey that I recognized about halfway, I was like, wow, you know what? I know so little about the masculine. And in some ways it makes sense to me, right? The irony of it took me going into the feminine to then realize, oh, wow, I knew so little about the masculine. And so, that became my own journey into looking at, what is men's work. I started reading, Iron John and King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and I started to kind of do the homework, on that side. And then what I recognized through that excavation was, at the time, this is maybe 5 years ago, and I was about 30, 34, 35 then. And it was surprising to me that I never really heard about this stuff, and I reached the age that I do in this culture that I do, that I'm in, modern sort of Canadian culture. And I hadn't really heard any of this stuff. So I was like, wait, where did it go? Because when I did the historical research and looked back, I found, oh, wow, like this peaked around the sort of early 90s, right? Felt when I heard stories of, there was hundreds of men's groups that would be meeting, this great wave of this willingness of men to, to dig into this stuff. And then it felt like it went underground. And I was curious about why. And so I started to, again, like ask people who'd been there, the people that I met from that older generation. And I was like, yeah, what happened? And they're like, we don't know. It just kind of, fizzled in some ways. And fizzled, I should say, it was brought into different realms, and people in my podcast now, Martin Shaw, Michael Mead, and others, they talk about this, which is why, I asked him about it. But I'll wrap that all up to say that, I recognized that there was some kind of thing that was missing. There was some bridge that wasn't happening between the previous mythopoetic men's movement and the present. And I do feel that there's a resurgence happening. I was last year in contact with Sacred Sons, an organization that grew out of Mankind Project, who also uses archetypal mythology to do men's work, men's soul work. And Sacred Sons was actually an offshoot in some ways. At least one of the members, had spent a lot of time in MKP. So I saw that. I was like, wow, it's happening, the next wave. But it's like they don't seem to really be in contact with each other, and I was like, well, there's got to be a lot that was learned that, ask the ones that were there and transmit that, right? And also the new ones, bring in new energy, recognizing you don't have to invent the wheel, that there's wheels have already been invented and there was reasons for that. And not to say that they're doing the same thing. I think they're actually taking it a lot further, but it would be folly to think that the young ones suddenly, have it and away they go. And, a lot of the same mistakes would likely be made. So that was a key mission of why the podcast came about. I wanted to connect these generations, right? And then the other thing is that I wanted to bring in a lot of other perspectives that I feel are pretty absent, at least from this sort of European focused archetypal mythological conversation, which doesn't bring in or hasn't in the past really brought in a lot of indigenous cosmologies or even perspectives of, mythology from, just from other lenses that I felt would be really useful. And so, like you said, it feels like it's hit a spot, certainly that I was longing for, in the cultural ecosystem. And I'm grateful to feel like that this has begun to fill it.
Yeah, beautiful. I think the first conversation I listened to was the one with Pat McCabe, and something in that really struck me in terms of looking at elements of masculine and feminine. When she said, we don't know anything about this outside of a domination model or a power over model, and her putting forth this thriving life. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that I'm actually going to be interviewing in the near future Rian Eisler, who wrote the book The Chalice and the Blade, which was, again, a sort of well-known book, more so about maybe decade and a half ago, which really examined this historical rise of patriarchal culture, although she doesn't use the language very much. She actually differentiates patriarchy from what might better be understood, like you said, as dominator culture. And I think that's I think it's a helpful nuance because often, in the modern context, often patriarchy as understood as the rule of men creates a understanding that essentially the rule of men is inherently dominator culture. There's no separation between that. And that creates a kind of very, dangerous box, I think, to put that understanding in, because then we see a lot of the sort of gender wars that go on, right? That men are inherently dominator if they're put in positions of power, and therefore women who are in positions of power inherently are better. And I think from some examples that we've seen of women in power, Hillary Clinton and others. I think there was a woman, Sharon, I can't remember her name, Facebook CEO or COO. But just we've seen women in these positions of power, and if they don't fundamentally interact with differently than the male counterparts, what happens is they enact the same behavior. Just happen to be a woman, and that really what that does is it makes one be curious about the systemic kind of underpinnings that value certain things over others, which is why I think Pat McCabe really brings in a great lens when she says, yeah, if we plug the men or women or any gender into the system without changing the system, the same things are going to be happening. And so she really brings in this kind of wondering and a curiosity about, what would a sort of masculine behaviors be like in an entirely different system, which she, shares as a sort of thriving life picture is what she uses. And others, I would say people like Charles Eisenstein maybe use the phrase, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And others, have different ways of naming this, but really to get one to be able to see, to step outside the water that we've been swimming in and imagine what might be possible.
Yeah. It's a friend of ours, a writer, Philip Shepard. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, I've interviewed him actually for a future podcast. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. But he has this term, patrifocal, where he says it's actually the whole, continuum of masculine and feminine tends in modern life to have a patrifocal view, that we value the reasoning and the analysis of the head over that, different kind of knowingness of the belly or the heart. And whatever you filter through that system tends to go in that direction. Yeah, I think that's, the patriarchy, it's a hard word, and there's so much charge to it.
Yeah, I mean, I could unpack that a little more, to say that, I feel like I recognize the intention of naming it that way. Like, that to me is really important, rather than, I don't know, kind of dismiss because the word doesn't quite fit, like, which can sometimes happen. And I do think, I see there's a real value in being able to name, again, like a structural label for this kind of thing. And at the same time, I think because of the lack of nuance, it kind of, again, creates a kind of, I don't know, false war that doesn't really give it anywhere else to go. Like, as in, it kind of generates its own opposition. Whereas I think coming to it from an understanding of, what are dominator behaviors, or what gives rise to dominator culture, is a different conversation, and it gives a lot more room, to I think create pathways of possibility. And so I think that's very important as well, to recognize that there is something happening that has been happening that needs to be named. And yet, again, I wonder about how to go, what generates possibility and what closes it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say you could extend that to the toxic masculinity term that is so present now. And yes, there have been deeply harmful toxic behaviors coming from men, but when it becomes that sort of gravitational pull, probably for many people, when they hear the word masculinity, it's associated with toxic these days. And I think that's a really harmful thing for our sons and daughters when that gets bound together. Again, coming back to the toxicity being that domination model.
Yeah, and I guess that's the question too, right? Where does the toxicity reside? Like, I guess that's really the question. Now, does it arise and generate from men? Do you know what I mean? Does it originate in men? And that's, I think, an important question, because if one is able to see it actually as coming from the system at large, or the culture at large, then you see it more that all of us within that cultural paradigm are affected by it. Men and women and all genders, and there's certain behaviors and things that will flow from that cultural toxicity. And so, again, I don't want to then therefore say, okay, so women are just as complicit in it. Again, that to me, again, is like, that's not the right kind of whataboutism, with this conversation, but really just the ability to see it more as an ecosystem that each part affects the other part, and like everybody plays certain roles within the toxicity. And so, again, that to me feels like it generates, I don't know, a different kind of approach to how we might shift from this, culture we're in, to one that's much more in contact, much more generative.
Yeah. What comes up for me is just that, the Watiko or indigo, consumptive, hungry ghost consciousness that's so pervasive in modern life.
Yeah.
I remember in your beautiful film you did with Stan Rushforth, where he was saying, so many people now are turning toward wanting to have access to Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of healing, and yet it's so often approached with that same, we want to extract that like we've extracted everything else from this culture. Yeah.
And I mean, what comes to me actually is, I'm just finishing a book right now, actually, called The Inconvenient Indian, which is written by Thomas King, I believe, I think he's Canadian, but he talks about the North American, history around Indigenous peoples, and it's a fascinating read, very well written. But he really highlights this sense of, I guess, kind of entitlement born of a kind of, I don't know, commodification of the world as a whole. And I was thinking back to my time, I was in Australia a number of years ago. I've been 3 times, actually. The first time was my own, sort of just wanting to step out of my, cultural understanding, some might call it a kind of walkabout, or a desire for some kind of initiation of some kind, but this is way early days and I didn't know anything about that stuff. But I went down to Australia and I traveled around, backpacked. And when I got to Ayers Rock, the Indigenous name Uluru, it was closed to tourists from climbing it. And I think that was a fairly recent thing at the time. This might have been early 2000. I was there, I think 2001. And I remember at the time feeling a sense of like, what? Outrage as a tourist, like, what? I can't climb it? Like, there's somewhere as a tourist, as a white person, that I can't go? That's not fair. This sense of entitlement, right? And to them, of course, it's deeply sacred to the indigenous peoples of that area, that, has a real significance that is sort of not open. It's not a commodity. It's not an experience, for them to like, check the box or to, sell trinkets or something. Like they hold it in very different regard. And so just the idea that I wasn't allowed, butted up against my sense of entitlement, that anywhere I should be able to go, if I could pay for it, if I could pay the admission fee or something. And that worldview is so different, right, from an indigenous understanding. And so I guess that to me is the distinction as well between a sense of the world and indigenous wisdom, let's say, which is born of an actual relationship, which actually has a degree of reciprocity and courtship and approach and all these things, versus turning indigenous wisdom into a commodity, right? Which is, like just the next gold rush, which is, I think, what Stan Rushworth was speaking about in his film, which is exactly that. If indigenous wisdom is approached with the same hungry ghost mentality, then you're just going to consume it. You're not actually going to understand it as in, the power that it actually holds, or the gift that it actually holds.
Yeah. I think I recall when we were having a conversation with one of your teachers, Stephen Jenkinson, and we were talking about initiation and how, so many of us are feeling this deep longing for initiatory process that has been absent in modern culture. And he was describing, that the edge of like, if you think you should be entitled to initiation, like the gold rush, or if there's something that yearns for it and seeks it out through, like your journey to Australia or other things, like when there's something deeper that is moving toward, rather than some things like, well, I'm kind of lost and I should have initiations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even the should, right? That's such an interesting understanding. And we don't need to unpack it here, but oftentimes, the book of shoulds, wondering where that comes from.
Yeah, I would love to go into your episode with Martin Shaw, which again, there's so many nuggets in that. But one that I really appreciated that I think is many modern men are missing is just the sense of the wildness and the eroticism. And I remember you talked about your conversation with him in a bar, saying like that the pornography was one of the things that limited men's freedom most in these times.
I think he said domesticates.
Domesticates, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I'd love to hear you reflect on that.
Sure. It's interesting. The parallel that I actually draw is between my experience in a community in Portugal called Tamera, of which, I could spend a lot of time talking about. But I've been working on a film for the last 5 years based on their research in love and sexuality and partnership, and really understanding what I would call like a village model for navigating love and belonging and connection, and in particular like an attitude towards eros, which is understood not just as sexual love but just like pure life energy. That they have really developed a kind of sophisticated cultural model in which to allow for a lot more true liberation around this energy. And it's interesting to think of modern America, let's say, which in some ways, at least at the surface, appears to be sexually liberated. But by that meaning that if you wanted to compare it to, say, like a Middle Eastern repressed, quote, repressed culture of the women are all covered up and all the rest. And, it's easy to look at that and say, oh, wow, they're so repressed in America, we're so free. And I think it's a very immature understanding, actually, one, about what true liberation actually means around in this context. But then also that I would say America is the most heavily commodified in regards to sexuality. Right. And we talk about, sexualities, particularly feminine sexualities, used to sell everything. And pornography, in a way, is also an extension of that objectification of sexuality. And so there's a whole, value system which feeds off of, I would call it a perversion of eros. And by that, I don't mean the people participating necessarily, like sex workers and things. Because in some sense, in an economic system where often women are at a disadvantage because of how much paid to men, or certain professions are favored for men and not for women, and all the rest, that some women choose to go into the sex trade or into pornography as a means of economic sovereignty, right? Which, again, fair enough. And at the same time, I see sometimes that the kind of liberatory claiming of power in that situation is also based, again, upon a much larger system, like I've just said, which often holds women at a disadvantage. And so in some sense, it's like, it's the savviest decision in a culture which holds women at a disadvantage to, take your power back and use your sexuality, let's say, to attain sovereign resource, But I think in regards to it, though, if we look at the function of pornography, like Martin said, it domesticates, meaning that it kind of transacts what I would call a different archetypal relationship to that energy. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately about what is it. And, I spoke about it a little bit in this more recent example of Nako Bear. The musician that recently was called out for, some deeply inappropriate acts with minors, and in general, just a really, let's say, a dysfunctional relationship to, sexuality and relating often to these women. And I use the lens of the addicted lover to kind of unpack that. And I think it's relevant here in that to say that, a culture which doesn't create the space or the insight to be able to unpack, like, what is it that drives that kind of commodified, consumptive relationship to the feminine, is itself, again, that's what I'm saying by, it's the water that we're swimming in. And so, a mature culture in love and sexuality and eros would actually create the spaces like Tamara does to unpack it transparently in community to actually create the possibility of healing. But I would argue that this culture on large doesn't want healing because it trades on and earns off of that dysfunction, right? Like billions and billions is made, in the porn industry. So that's what I mean. Like the men are sort of led to and actually supported in, treating this energy as a commodity and to consume it versus to actually seek, deeper healing. And so the pathways to open up a deep kind of mature eroticism, for me, I'm still exploring this, a newbie in so many ways, but it comes from a very different approach, I think, to understanding, like, what is eroticism? Like Martin talks about this capacity to, speak secret names into that which you love and behold in the world, like the beauty of the world, and how that actually is such a necessary relationship to cultivate. That then when one meets, in this case, if we're speaking heteronormative, if a man meets a woman and is able to behold her beauty, it's not a substitute for his capacity to see the beauty of the world. He doesn't try to hold that and like burden the human relationship with that kind of, weight, but able to say, this beauty of the world, and then I see the beauty in you. And, again, it's just a lot more, achieved. And, like Martin says, a woman can smell the difference, if there's the desperation or the projection or the objectification. So there you go.
Yeah. And I think too, there's a way, bodily, you can see how we're often, if we're in more of a head way of happening, we don't integrate the energies of the pelvis, genitals and the abdomen. And so it tends to, I mean, like if you look at many of the scandals in, Buddhist communities or yoga communities, it's not that teachers are embezzling funds or something. It's inappropriate sexual activity that often goes, even if people are really developed along certain channels of realization, that's one that can tend to stay adolescent or isolated.
Yeah, and I do want to highlight as well, for me, understanding, that there's so much that goes into keeping that kind of stuff below the surface. That because I think it's important to proceed from this foundational understanding that, if I was a man in that position of being surrounded by a degree of women that I found attractive, that were giving their power away, right, because of the structures of perception of power. And again, like in a culture where a man with high status is seen as desirable and favorable, and women, by and large, if they don't have deep anchoring in their own center, and as well as their connection to other women, and particularly elder women, if they don't have a deeply anchored women's community, then they're susceptible also to playing that other side of the role, right? And that doesn't excuse the behavior of the men in power to trespass, but all I'm saying is it's really important to be able to see it within that ecosystem. And so I would argue that if we proceed from that understanding that any man in that position is likely, or I should say, swayed by that very dynamic, then we need to put accountability, circles of accountability that actually create the space for these things to be spoken about, to be checked, ongoingly, as opposed to, when there's a scandal and all of a sudden, oh, it's a bad apple, and how did we not know, and blah, and the cycle continues. So yeah, I see it deeply as a structural thing, as well as, of course, kind of proceeding wide open, that, this thing, it's an old story and it happens again and again and again and again. So, we have to be able to change the culture rather than simply see it as an isolated, person and incident.
Yeah, that's well said. Another conversation that I loved that you had was with Daniel Four, and something about that bringing in ways of relating to the unseen world, and like you said, more of a kind of courting and just the way that we can learn relationship skills, whether it's with other men or women or these unseen forces and ancestors and plants, and that there's something about just animistic basic values that feels like a pretty essential piece for the masculine in these times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me what comes up is this need to demonstrate, to affirm, to plead with men to see themselves as of consequence, right? That I think because we exist in a culture where, again, consequence or power is seen as markers of status and hierarchy, and signifiers of wealth and resource, and power is seen as essentially the ability to dominate, right, or to make others do your will, the application of force, right? And then therefore, if those are upheld as the markers of what power is, then you set up this the seeking of power, and those kinds of power. And then it's no surprise to me that then we have essentially the ongoing phenomena of men who, for multitude of reasons, don't feel powerful, then step into an expression of what feels like power to them, which is often, or can be, a kind of violent expression, right, of domination over another who's, quote, weaker, or at the extreme, stepping out and shooting people en masse, as I would see that as essentially a last ditch effort to demonstrate or to claw at some degree of power, to say, hey, I'm visible, I'm here. And in some sense that to the extreme turns the others who are the victims of this into simply an object of their need to enact their power, right? And I really want men to understand that that their degree of consequence, the ripples of their consequence are ongoing. And unless they're led to understand their wake, then this is what the outcome often is. Like I said, like they don't feel powerful, they don't feel consequence. And yet, if one considers the rest of the world and the non-human and the other than human and all the rest, that, every decision is deeply of consequence to the rest of the world. And we're not just talking about, purchasing this or that, but even, I'll just give an example of when I'm part of a cycle of, I won't use the word vision fast or vision quest because it's not that spectacular, but really a period. I like the word often wilderness vigil or just wilderness sit. And I've participated in 2 years now in this first time out in enough of a wilderness to be, sort of outside of the eyes of others, but not so far away that I couldn't hear them. Like as in hear people, like going about their activities. And I was really struck in my time out there, and it was a 4 days, 3 nights, no food, no water, but really just being there and just not doing something else. And what I found was the capacity to like drop into a kind of wavelength and a pace that felt much more of the pace of the world itself, right? And only by committing and sitting for that long did I start to recognize how fast humans are moving, most of the time, right? And in particular, often men who are sort of end up being disembodied, overly connected to, the intellect in the head and just sort of zipping about. And I really started to see the kind of consequences that were wrought not through any particular intention of those people, but yet they were consequential anyway. And by this, I'm saying, hearing like motorboats, ripping up and down the river and the sound that traveled. And I really started to get a sense of like, wow, this is what's happening often. And most people don't know it. Like most people and men, don't know that this is their consequence on everything else. The waves that continually hit the shore and erode the banks, whatever beings that happen to be making that place their home, the consequence of them being, hit multiple times a day by waves, rolling in off the shore because, maybe these guys like to have a joyride, on the lake, with a few beers or something like, so you know what I mean? It's like, but I guess what I'm saying is that understanding of one's wake is not a given. Like it's not something that, somebody tends to come to, oh, wow, I didn't realize it was so consequential. Like that for me, this is actually the function of initiation in a village understanding is that in particular, say for a man, that he can come to his understanding his consequence, and oftentimes this takes the elders to visit this upon them, because it's not something that they will arrive at on their own.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm reminded of Francis Weller has talked about power traditionally as not being an individual sense, but power is a byproduct of relationship, two ancestors, two place, that it's always more about the net of belonging than my separate individual sense over. And it's such a different sense of accessing power.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just to comment on that, what comes to me is it's almost now I see perhaps in the spectrum of power or expressions of power that the ability to force one into submission, into what you quote want them to do is probably the lowest form of power actually, right? Because in some sense, it doesn't actually require relationship. Like it doesn't actually require an equitable relationship. It requires more ability to dominate. And that's not really a relationship. That's essentially one based on coercion or fear, or the threat of violence. And for most men, like that's largely, consciously or unconsciously what they know as power. And again, what a withered understanding of power. And I really appreciate the version you just brought in.
Yeah, and I think, many men can fear their own power when they see how that dominant power can happen, either outside or inside.
Yeah, I'll say it for me as well. Like this is also why I think, for men that maybe do have an aversion to participating in that kind of power often shrink, right, and go the other direction. And this is what happened to me for a number of years, which is why I hadn't really even come to my sense that I hadn't known much about the masculine, is because I had, in a way, abdicated that role, and that it took, being almost in 35 to come to that place of realizing it was a real deficit, in my life, and recognizing that just because I wanted to, avoid participating in that kind of power, the domination over power, it meant that I had actually kind of disavowed or dismissed a degree of my own masculinity, that, and to come to a level of intimacy with a different kind of power and a different kind of consequence. And so I see a lot of men go through this pattern, like they try that direction. They say, okay, I'm not going to be that. I'm going to be a good guy. I'm going to be an ally to women, this and that. And they end up essentially proceeding without building a relationship to that part of themselves. And in some sense, it makes them dangerous in a different way to women in particular, right? And certainly to other men, that there's not a degree of both self-knowledge and relationship to really find deep solidarity actually with other men, and to call men up, instead of out, which is often the case.
Yeah. In your conversation with Michael Mead, you were talking about the king, warrior, magician, lover archetypes, and the sort of limitations that can come with any map. And I loved how he was talking about how the river of soul is going to carve its own way. It might be sometimes in alignment with those, but there's also so much more that's left out. And I'd like to hear you talk just about, through your conversations and your experience, the value or limitations of masculine and feminine.
I mean, I've really tried to arrive at somewhere where, again, not deciding, okay, this is the way it is and it'll forever be this way, but I've really tried to position myself on what I would consider places that feel sometimes oppositional, which is those that advocate to stop using those words, to describe these energies, masculine and feminine, to try, there's yin and yang, active and passive or whatever. They try to come up with other labels to allow for a more accessible, because then the apologists of the ones that want to use that language is they'll often say, okay, well, we're using masculine and feminine, but we don't mean all men and all women. And then, go on from there. And I do see it as a bit of a, I feel like it needs a bit more nuance than that often, to appease those that say, well, they're just not useful then if they keep getting confused with all men and all women. And the way that I would answer this too is that, and this is just what I'm, feeling these days, which is there's something in using that language still, those labels, that I still feel is useful, because I feel like it invites a kind of embodied, ability to dance, between these energies that otherwise feel too abstract for me, right? And in my observable, life experience, that that there's something that I can perceive, which I would say is feminine, and that often expresses itself through women that, I experience. And, again, one could say, well, that's your projection or your objectification or your conditioning and blah, 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 and just take a fully kind of reduction or deconstructivist position. And then I see somebody like Pat McCabe, right, who says, yeah, I was like that too. And then I saw Indigenous ceremony, and suddenly I could see it differently. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I think so much of the language and gender and the gender kind of challenges is, I think, often informed by the wound. Like, it's informed by a culture that is so deeply dysfunctional around gender as a whole that any, response to it often is kind of like, let's throw it out. Or as Bio talked about, this idea of postmodernism, it just wants to add more boxes, and call that the response. And yet there's a whole other way of approaching it, which, again, I've only really witnessed as well, almost in a village context, where it's not like, okay, all the men have to be like this and all the women have to be like this. But for the purposes often of ceremony, when, I talk about experiences in Tamara, I experienced this where, the men would go off and we'd have, time to ourselves, and the women would go off, and we would just experience, like, I don't know what to call it, a field of men, both literally, we were in a field, and the energetic presence of men that fed me in a way that, I'd never experienced before that time. And the women reporting the same, like, wow, it's so beautiful just to be with women, and parts of me unfolded and relaxed and da-da-da. And so, I don't know why that is, but it just seems to be what it is, So I find that language that doesn't include that experiential just, pattern that keeps showing up, to me feels, again, like it's kind of dismissing too much in order to try to fix something, but not recognizing that it's also coming from often a very wounded place.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I'd love to hear just, from the broad ranges of conversations you've had with guests, what are some aspirations or directions you have, or, for someone listening to this who hasn't come across men's work, or, what sort of invitations would you offer?
Now, in particular for men to connect with my podcast, or just in, men's archetypal
just like
work?
The discoveries that you've had in this journey so far with these conversations.
Yeah, I think, what I most value, I think, from when I first started to connect with this work, in particular, like the men's archetypal mythology, and really uncovering what felt like a map, right, to my internal landscape, which, again, it's important not to then say, okay, the map is the territory, but just to recognize I was able for me to begin to see myself in a different light, my story, the different forces that within me and within others, and in that sense, illuminated and kind of provided a capacity to navigate, both myself and the wider culture at large. And so I think that's a huge benefit to men who encounter this and begin to allow it to inform them, because I think, again, a lot of men typically, in this culture, have a degree of superficiality with other men. In particular, if they even have ones they could call friends, where oftentimes they may hang out, drink beers or whatever, play sports or whatever it is, which are valuable. But oftentimes I meet men who feel they want to go deeper and they don't know how. They don't know how. They don't have the tools. And even if there's a threshold of kind of intimacy that feels kind of like, like, whoa. Feelings or, this kind of stuff can often be confronting to men, but there's still, I feel like, a deeper soul longing to touch those places. And so, to have the tools and the map, I think, to deepen is like such a value to men. And also to begin to recognize, there's others, on this path. And something, I think it was Martin Shaw that said this as well, that, oftentimes men have to see a model of a man being a certain way, that provides a sense of, oh, wow, this is possible, and in particular, men that are further along the path of, capacity to feel, to tap into embodiment, to develop and to express a degree of solidarity, mutual love, all these things that, again, to be in the presence of, I think activates like a deeper, satiation that men need in order for their own soul, to feel grounded and to unfold their own gifts, and to step out of a lot of what I would call unconscious competition with men, right? Which again is part of the culture that we swim in. And I think, being able to do so, I think allows for, a type of freedom, a type of groundedness to take hold. And then, I don't know, just different questions arise and different possibilities, come forth.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me, like you said, that there can be a tendency to stay in a shallow end of interaction. And I think also just the range of acceptable tributes for men, particularly in this culture, is so small. I know you and Day hit on that in the Queering the Pandemic episode. Mm-hmm. But, there's often such a sense of this heroic model and not including other aspects of ways of knowing that can show up as the masculine.
Mm-hmm. And there's something, I'm just reminded of the interview with Eamon Armstrong, which is, I think, number 6, The Boy Hero Must Die. And the piece that I really appreciated from our conversation, where we talked about how, there's something about men needing to be defeated. and often that can come around 35, 40, which is often what's understood to be like the midlife crisis time, where essentially maybe all of the things they set in motion in their 20s or early 30s sort of burn, in a pile of rubble or come crashing down. And for me, that was the case. I was divorced when I was 33, and that really shook me, to the deepest places of the life that I thought I had and who I was becoming. All of this came crashing down, and suddenly I was like, okay, wait a second, what did I miss? What was I not aware of? What other possibilities might there be? And so I think that there was a need to be defeated in order for me to be able to, really ask different questions, or to look out and say, oh, wow, this kind of lone wolf thing isn't working that well. And so I think, that may be in this culture what's needed over and over again, because again, like a larger culture of men's sort of, a mature culture of men is less visible. I mean, it's growing for sure. And I think if, the more and more work that's done in the generations to come, it's like they get to experience these things from a much earlier age. I never even sat in a circle until I was probably like 27, right? Which, again, blows my mind. And my son now, who's, he's about 21 months now. I mean, it's wild that I think that, I live in a community home as well, but, we've traveled to different ceremonies, village ceremonies, ritual, been to Tamara, he's been in, 200 circles, and he's not even 2. So not like he fully understands, of course, what's going on, and that's part of it, that they're not, that age, you're not really supposed to, quote, get it. But there's something that I think that they're absorbing, a way of adults being together that they're recognizing as normal, right? Of like, oh, this is how humans do it. And I trust that, as he grows older, is more able to participate actively in these kinds of things, that he'll just have like an instinct for it, based on that much experience being in on these ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So our son is 10 now, and for the last 4 or 5 years, he's had a sense of like, oh, eventually at this point there'll be an initiation process, and he'll refer to like, oh, what's that one when I'll be out in the woods by myself, or with the my friends in the desert, and just to have some of those elements of community and circle and impending ritual.
Yeah,
initiation.
Exactly. Beautiful.
I'm curious just about, it seems like so many challenges for men, women, everyone in modern life is the lack of village, the lack of community. And I know you've done work with Tamara and, living in a community yourself, but how do we bring elements of that into these separate homes, and often not having what has fed human beings in being in community and ritual?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I like to differentiate too what I have come to understand, like the nuances and possibilities of community, of village, just so people understand what we're talking about. Because I think a lot of people might say, oh, I live in the suburbs, and I occasionally talk to my neighbor, and we live in a good community, right? Like some may say that. And I like to think of village in particular as both an achievement, as well as a verb, right? So it'd be more accurate, I think, to say, or more telling to say, to village, right? Because it's sort of it's a done thing, and I think that how that might look is sometimes romanticized, right? With people say, you know what, let's get our friends together and we'll buy a piece of land and we'll just go out there and just do the thing. And, maybe that might work. It probably won't though, to be honest, because, what people often think village is, sharing, food, maybe having potlucks occasionally. Kids get to play together, that's cool. But what actually happens, my experience when you live in community is all of your shadow comes up and you can't hide, from all of those patterns and blind spots that you have, and neither can other people. And so if you don't have really good conflict resolution or transformative tools to move through these things, then you're probably going to burn out and, collapse, which is what happened to, I think, a lot of the communities that started with good intentions in the, 60s and 70s. And so that's one thing to recognize. And I think, too, that the way through that, may not be the sort of grand idea to all head over to land, and start there. But, what does it mean to village in your community, with gathering around trusted others, other families, around, and this is something I'm more recently coming to understand, is around the particular rhythms of life, right? So by this, we talked about initiation ceremony for, adolescent to adult, which often happens, I think, around, puberty. So, 13, 14, 15 for boys. And there's lots of other times actually that, others are needed for, to pull off certain things. And I'll say, for example, like when our son was born, we had a naming ceremony for him, right? Where we gathered with others and held a ritual around, introducing him to the community and bringing forth his name. I've seen others for, walkout ceremonies, which is when they're able to walk and you bring others around, and that becomes, again, a piece of that rhythm. Certainly around relationship, people are used to, for example, marriages, right? As a moment of community coming in. And I would make the case, though, that we really need community for relationships ending, which is a very, kind of like what thought to, this culture that's just addicted to the high, right? And not really doesn't want to stick around for, the hard labor of, helping things end. And this is why so many relationships end in so bitterly, I think, because they actually don't have the kinds of support they need to properly close a relationship. And, the mayhem and carnage, is left to the lawyers. So that's another moment. And in particular, lots of things, could be elder initiations from stepping into, that age of life into a function in community of elders, a function, as I've come to understand, not a person. And in this culture, because we don't have, these ways of tempering and experiencing, all of these rhythms of village along the way, we have a lot of olders in this culture, right? Which is those who happen to be a certain age, but again, haven't been in on these kinds of things their whole life to then know what it means to be an elder when the function is called upon, right? And what a sad thing, but we got to start somewhere. And then, of course, in particular, death and how often, the circle the wagons kind of approach is used to only, close family only. That's it. Everybody out. Where again, a very withered understanding about the role of village to come in and to support and to hold this, challenging time for a family. Again, so all of these rhythms, if somebody said to me, where should we start with village? I would say get people at these moments. Get trusted others at these moments, because those rhythms will start to build a sense of, trust and solidarity and capacity. And then, if you choose at some point to say, you know what, we're getting good at this, why don't we all live together somewhere? Then you've got some time in, right? But you don't wait to discover all of the stuff that you didn't know about each other, and that you have zero capacity by just heading to the land and saying, yo, let's do this. So that's where I'd recommend you start.
Yeah, I think that's a great inquiry. Mm-hmm. So I know we're getting toward the end of our time here. I would love to just hear of any, current projects or upcoming offerings that you have that people might be able to reach out to you or get in touch with mm-hmm. the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as far as the podcast, The Mythic Masculine, I'm excited to grow our online community, particularly though around, I've tried to figure out what is the sweet spot of this, community. And I do feel in some ways it is a scholarly endeavor, where my goal would be that, a lot of these resources around, archetypal mythopoetic lens is unpacked, and lots of other pathways are formed and offered and made visible, so that people, when they tune in, like me, if I was 35 and I found this, I'd be like, oh my God, this is amazing, right? Like this is what I want it to be. And at the same time, it's not like a movement. I'm not advocating for organization, like circles to meet necessarily. And now all of a sudden I'm trying to, pull off another Mankind project or something. Like, at least for me, that's not my intention. But I will say that, I think there's value in also we're going to be inviting a number of the interview guests to offer like specific teachings within the network as well. So I'm excited about that because I know a lot of them have said, like Pat McCabe, she's like, I'd love to just talk with men, for a couple of days and go deeper into what she was saying and, how beautiful that would be. So we're going to be developing that series. And then, in the future, I'd say it is open. I have felt that there's a degree of writing that I want to do around this, that the podcast is also a bit of a breadcrumb trail through the forest, as I'm also like exploring this. And I could see at some point, that there's brought forth together in a book of some kind, but that, is a little ways off. And then if people want to connect with my film work as well, though, which, like I said, I'm working on the film about Tamara as a major piece, they can go to, for that one, loveschoolfilm.com. Or if they want to see majority of my work, which is mostly online, they can go to ianmac.com, ianmack.com. And then, of course, the Mythic Masculine, easy to find, themythicmasculine.com to check out, all of the episodes on there.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, man. It was really a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.